Before you click away, I want you to think about someone in your life who never gave you a fair chance. Someone who judged you before knowing you. Someone who seemed irritated by your presence, questioned your intentions, or quietly rooted against you for reasons you could never understand. Now here's the question that might change the way you see people forever. What if their problem was never you? What if the reason some people secretly dislike you has absolutely nothing to do with your flaws and everything to do with your strengths? Most people spend years trying to answer the wrong question. What did I do wrong? What should I change? How can I make them like me? But by the end of this video, you're going to discover a truth that most people never understand. Even after a lifetime of relationships, you're going to learn why confidence can make people uncomfortable, why your growth can create enemies you never expected, why some people criticize you the moment you start succeeding, why authenticity attracts resistance, and most importantly, why seeking approval from everyone may be the very thing that's holding you back from becoming the person you're meant to be. What you're about to hear isn't motivational fluff. It's a psychological reality hidden beneath human behavior. A reality that explains why some people celebrate your failures, question your successes, and resent you even when you've done nothing to deserve it. And if you've ever felt confused by someone's negativity, hurt by unfair criticism, or exhausted from trying to be understood, stay with me, because the final lesson in this video has the power to completely free you from the opinions that have controlled your confidence for far too long. And once you see this truth, you'll never look at people or yourself the same way again. Let's start with a truth that most people spend years misunderstanding. Not everyone who dislikes you has a reason that has anything to do with you. That sounds strange because we've been conditioned to believe that negative reactions must be earned. We assume that if someone is cold toward us, dismissive of us, or secretly rooting against us, then we must have made a mistake somewhere along the way. We begin searching our behavior for answers. We replay conversations. We question our decisions. We wonder what we said, what we did, or what we should have done differently. But there is a deeper reality hiding beneath many of these situations. Sometimes people react negatively to your strengths, not your weaknesses. Think about that for a moment. One of the most uncomfortable experiences in life is realizing that your growth can create tension in relationships that once felt stable. The moment you begin improving yourself, something shifts. The moment you become more disciplined, more focused, more confident, more ambitious, or more self-respecting, some people become uncomfortable in ways they don't fully understand. The reason is psychological. Human beings naturally compare themselves to those around them. Whether consciously or unconsciously, we measure our progress, our success, and our self-worth against the people in our environment. Most of the time, this process happens automatically. We don't even realize we're doing it. Now imagine someone who has spent years telling themselves that change is impossible. Imagine someone who has convinced themselves that their situation cannot improve, that their dreams are unrealistic, or that their limitations are permanent. Then you come along. You begin growing. You begin succeeding. You begin becoming the person you always said you wanted to become. Suddenly, your existence challenges the story they've been telling themselves. And that's where the discomfort begins. Because your success becomes evidence. Your discipline becomes evidence. Your courage becomes evidence. Your willingness to improve becomes evidence. Evidence that change is possible. Evidence that excuses are optional. Evidence that growth can happen. And for someone who has built their identity around remaining the same, that evidence can feel threatening. The human mind has an interesting way of protecting itself from uncomfortable truths. When faced with information that challenges our beliefs, we have two choices. We can change ourselves, or we can reject the information. Changing ourselves requires effort, humility, and accountability. Rejecting the information requires none of those things. That's why many people choose the second option. Instead of asking, what can I learn from this person? They ask, what's wrong with this person? Instead of feeling inspired, they feel irritated. Instead of becoming curious, they become critical. Instead of growing, they begin judging. And often, They don't even realize what they're doing. This is why some people seem bothered by your confidence. Not arrogance, not superiority, just confidence. A person who is comfortable with themselves doesn't feel threatened by someone else. Self-respect. But a person struggling with insecurity often does. Your confidence reminds them of the confidence they wish they had. Your boundaries remind them of the boundaries they never established. Your courage reminds them of the opportunities they were afraid to pursue. And every reminder creates tension. The irony is that people often assume hatred comes from power. In reality, it frequently comes from comparison. When someone feels secure in who they are, they don't spend much time tearing others down. They don't obsess over another person's achievements. They don't become consumed by someone else's success. Secure people are too busy building their own lives. The people who constantly criticize, undermine, gossip, and resent are often revealing far more about their internal struggles than they are about the person they're targeting. This doesn't mean everyone who disagrees with you is jealous. That's not the lesson. The lesson is that not every negative reaction deserves your guilt. Not every criticism deserves your emotional energy. Not every act of hostility deserves a personal explanation. Sometimes the issue exists entirely within the other person's perspective. And understanding this can be incredibly liberating, because one of the greatest emotional burdens people carry is the belief that they must be liked by everyone. They spend years trying to manage other people's opinions. They carefully adjust their personality. They suppress their ambitions. They hide their strengths. They avoid standing out. They become smaller versions of themselves in hopes of becoming more acceptable. But here's what life eventually teaches. You can make yourself smaller, and some people will still dislike you. You can become quieter, and some people will still criticize you. You can sacrifice your authenticity, and some people will still find reasons to judge you. Because the problem was never your size. The problem was what your existence represented. And once you understand that, everything changes. You stop apologizing for your growth. You stop feeling guilty for your success. You stop shrinking your goals to make other people comfortable. You stop carrying responsibility for emotions that don't belong to you. The philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche once suggested that resentment often emerges when people feel powerless to achieve what they admire in others. Instead of pursuing growth themselves, they transform admiration into hostility. What could have become inspiration becomes resentment. What could have become motivation becomes criticism. And unfortunately, this pattern appears everywhere. You see it in workplaces. You see it in friendships. You see it in families. You see it online. The person making progress often becomes a target for those unwilling to confront their own stagnation. But here's the part that matters most. Never allow someone else's discomfort to become a reason for your self-doubt. Never mistake another person's insecurity for evidence that you're doing something wrong. Never assume that criticism automatically means correction is needed. Sometimes criticism reveals wisdom, but sometimes criticism reveals envy. Learning the difference is one of the most important skills you will ever develop. Because the moment you start believing every negative opinion, you hand over control of your identity to people who may not even understand themselves. Your job is not to become less confident so others feel better. Your job is not to become less ambitious so others feel safe. Your job is not to dim your light because someone else prefers darkness. Your responsibility is growth. Your responsibility is integrity. Your responsibility is becoming the strongest version of yourself. And if that makes certain people uncomfortable, let their discomfort teach them what your example already has. That transformation is possible. That growth is available. And that excuses are never stronger than commitment. The next time you notice someone reacting negatively to your progress, don't immediately ask yourself what you did wrong. Ask yourself a different question. What might my growth be reminding them about their own life? Because sometimes the strongest evidence that you do, moving in the right direction, is not the applause you receive. It's the resistance you encounter from people who refuse to move at all. And that's something worth remembering every single day. Now, once you understand that your strengths can trigger other people's insecurities, another important truth begins to reveal itself. Most people will never tell you the real reason they resent you. In fact, One of the most fascinating things about human psychology is that envy almost never introduces itself honestly. Nobody walks up to you and says, "I dislike you because your success reminds me of my failures." Nobody says, "Your confidence makes me question my own insecurities." Nobody admits, "Watching you improve forces me to confront the areas of my life I've neglected." Instead, envy puts on a disguise. It changes its appearance. It hides behind masks that look completely unrelated. And if you don't understand this, you can spend years confused by people's behavior. You'll wonder why someone criticizes everything you do. You'll wonder why certain individuals seem determined to find flaws in your character. You'll wonder why some people become distant the moment things start going well for you. You'll wonder why support disappears exactly when success arrives. The answer is often simpler than you think. Envy rarely attacks directly. It attacks indirectly. Because admitting envy requires self-awareness. It requires humility. It requires a person to acknowledge an uncomfortable emotional truth. And many people are unwilling to do that. So instead of recognizing envy, they transform it into something else. They call it concern. They call it honesty. They call it advice. They call it criticism. But underneath the surface, the emotional engine driving the behavior remains the same. Think about how often you've seen this happen. Someone spends years ignoring your efforts, years overlooking your sacrifices, years dismissing your goals. Then suddenly, when progress begins to appear, they become interested, not supportive. Interested in finding flaws, interested in questioning your motives, interested in predicting your failure, interested in explaining why your success isn't as impressive as it seems. And the question is why? Because envy seeks balance. When someone feels inferior in comparison, they instinctively look for ways to restore their sense of superiority. One way is to improve themselves. The other way is to diminish the person they're comparing themselves to. Unfortunately, many people choose the second option because it's easier. Growth requires effort. Criticism requires words. And words are much cheaper than discipline. This is why gossip is often rooted in envy. People rarely gossip about those they genuinely don't care about. Think about that. The individuals who occupy the most space in someone's place. Negative conversations are often the very people they claim not to care about. If someone constantly talks about another person's achievements, appearance, relationships, opportunities, or success, they're revealing where their attention lives. And attention is valuable. We don't obsess over things that have no emotional impact on us. We obsess over things that trigger something within us. The philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer once observed that envy is a natural companion to comparison. The more people compare themselves to others, the more vulnerable they become to resentment. And today's world has amplified this tendency. People compare careers. They compare lifestyles. They compare relationships. They compare appearances. They compare accomplishments. And the result is often a quiet dissatisfaction that many never learn how to manage. Instead of asking, "How can I improve my own life?" they ask, "Why does this person have something I don't?" That question changes everything, because improvement focuses inward. Envy focuses outward. Improvement creates growth. Envy creates resentment. And resentment always looks for a target. What makes envy particularly dangerous is that it often disguises itself as moral judgment. Someone envies your confidence and suddenly labels you arrogant. Someone envies your ambition and suddenly calls you selfish. Someone envies your boundaries and suddenly accuses you of being cold. Someone envies your independence and suddenly claims you've changed. Notice the pattern. The very qualities responsible for your growth become the qualities people criticize. Not because those qualities are wrong, but because those qualities highlight something they haven't developed within themselves. And this creates one of the most important lessons you'll ever learn. Not all criticism deserves equal weight. This doesn't mean you should reject feedback. Wise people remain open to learning. Wise people remain teachable. Wise people listen. But wisdom also requires discernment. You must learn to distinguish between correction and projection. Correction helps you improve. Projection reveals another person's unresolved struggles. Correction is specific. Projection is emotional. Correction seeks growth. Projection seeks relief. And many people use criticism not to help you become better, but to make themselves feel better. The moment you recognize this, your relationship with negativity begins to change. You stop absorbing every opinion. You stop internalizing every insult. You stop treating every critic as a teacher, because not everyone speaking about you understands you, and not everyone judging you sees the full picture. One of the greatest mistakes people make is assuming that confidence means being unaffected by scent. That's not confidence. Confidence is understanding which criticism deserves your attention and which criticism deserves your distance. A confident person listens without surrendering their identity. A confident person evaluates feedback without abandoning their self-respect. A confident person understands that some voices deserve consideration while others deserve silence. And this becomes increasingly important as your life improves. Because the truth is, success attracts two groups of people: those who are inspired by your growth, and those who are threatened by it. The inspired ask questions. The threatened ask accusations. The inspired seek lessons. The threatened seek flaws. The inspired become better. The threatened become bitter. And your ability to recognize the difference may save you years of unnecessary self-doubt. Remember this: the people who genuinely support you don't become smaller when you succeed. They don't disappear when you win. They don't search for reasons to discredit your achievements. They celebrate your progress, because your success doesn't diminish their worth. Secure people understand that someone else's victory is not their defeat. But insecure people often struggle with that idea, and that's why envy continues to hide behind masks. It hides behind sarcasm. It hides behind gossip. It hides behind passive-aggressive comments. It hides behind unnecessary criticism. It hides behind skepticism. But eventually, every disguise reveals itself, because people can only hide their intentions for so long. Their words expose them. Their behavior exposes them. Their reactions expose them. And when you begin seeing these patterns clearly, something remarkable happens. You stop taking everything personally. You stop carrying emotional burdens that belong to other people. You stop explaining yourself to individuals who have already decided not to understand you. Most importantly, you stop allowing someone else's envy to become your limitation. Because your responsibility is not to shrink your success to make resentment comfortable. Your responsibility is to continue growing with integrity, humility, and purpose. And the next time someone disguises envy as criticism, don't immediately question your value. Take a closer look at the source, because sometimes the loudest criticism has very little to do with your flaws and everything to do with your potential. And that's worth remembering whenever the opinions of others try to convince you to become less than you were meant to be. Once you begin understanding that envy often hides behind criticism, another reality becomes impossible to ignore. The more authentic you become, the more resistance you will face. This surprises a lot of people because most of us grow up believing the opposite. We are taught that if we become better, people will automatically support us. If we become more honest, more genuine, more confident, and more aligned with our values, the world will reward us with acceptance and admiration. But life has a way of teaching a more complicated lesson. Authenticity attracts respect from the right people, but it often creates discomfort in the wrong people. And if you don't understand this, you may spend years trying to solve a problem that isn't actually a problem. You may think something is wrong because certain people seem uncomfortable around you. You may assume you've become difficult, selfish, arrogant, or disconnected. But often what they're reacting to isn't your behavior. They're reacting to your transformation. Because authenticity has a strange effect on human relationships. It exposes things. It reveals things. It shines light into places where people have become comfortable living in the dark. Think about what happens when someone stops pretending, when someone finally starts speaking honestly, when someone begins setting healthy boundaries, when someone refuses to tolerate disrespect, When someone stops chasing approval, when someone starts making decisions based on principles instead of popularity, that person becomes difficult to manipulate. And people who benefited from the old version of you often struggle with the new one. This is one of the reasons growth can feel lonely, not because growth separates you from everyone, but because growth separates you from people who were attached to a version of you that no longer exists. The version that always said yes. The version that stayed quiet. The version that ignored their own needs. The version that accepted less than they deserved. The version that constantly sought validation. Many people claim they want you to be yourself, but what they really mean is they want you to remain the version of yourself they're most comfortable with. And the moment you change, resistance appears. Not because authenticity is wrong, but because authenticity disrupts expectations. The philosopher Soren Kierkegaard once described authenticity as one of the highest expressions of human existence. To become yourself, he argued, is life's greatest task. But what he also understood was that becoming yourself requires separating from the pressures that constantly encourage conformity. And conformity is seductive. Conformity offers safety. It offers approval. It offers belonging. The problem is that it often demands a price. That price is your individuality. When you live according to other people's expectations, you may gain acceptance, but you lose something far more valuable. You lose yourself. And many people spend decades trapped in this conflict. They become experts at pleasing others, experts at adapting, experts at fitting in, but they quietly lose touch with who they truly are. Then one day something changes. They decide to stop performing. They decide to stop pretending. They decide to stop living for an audience. And suddenly people begin reacting differently. Why? Because authenticity acts like a mirror. The moment you start living honestly, you unintentionally expose where others are living dishonestly. Your courage highlights their fear. Your conviction highlights their uncertainty. Your self-respect highlights their lack of boundaries. Your independence highlights their dependence on approval. And not everyone appreciates those reminders. This is why authentic people are often misunderstood. Not because they're confusing, but because they're difficult to categorize. People become uncomfortable when they can't control your decisions through praise or criticism. They become uncomfortable when your identity is rooted in principles instead of public opinion. They become uncomfortable when your choices are guided by values instead of validation. Because a person who no longer needs approval becomes incredibly difficult to influence. And influence is something many people are accustomed to having. Consider how often social pressure shapes behavior. People dress a certain way because it's expected. They pursue careers because they're approved. They stay silent because speaking up creates risk. They remain in unhealthy situations because leaving invites judgment. In many cases, people aren't living authentically. They're living strategically. Every decision is filtered through one question: what will people think? Authentic individuals ask a different question: what is true? And those two questions often lead in very different directions. The first seeks acceptance. The second seeks integrity. The first prioritizes appearance. The second prioritizes reality. The first creates comfort. The second creates freedom. Freedom is powerful, but freedom can also be threatening to people who feel trapped. Because every authentic person becomes living proof that another way of life is possible. And proof makes excuses harder to maintain. That's why you'll often notice resistance increasing as your authenticity deepens. The more genuine you become, the more polarized reactions become. Some people will feel inspired. Others will feel challenged. Some will admire your confidence. Others will interpret it as arrogance. Some will appreciate your boundaries. Others will call you difficult. Some will respect your honesty. Others will accuse you of changing. The behavior is the same. The interpretations are different. And that's an important lesson. People don't react to reality alone. They react to their perception of reality. Two people can observe the exact same behavior and reach completely different conclusions, which means your goal cannot be controlling everyone's perception. That goal is impossible. No matter how carefully you explain yourself, someone will misunderstand. No matter how pure your intentions are, someone will question them. No matter how respectfully you communicate, someone will misinterpret your words. And the sooner you accept this, the more peaceful your life becomes. Because authenticity requires letting go of an exhausting burden, the burden of universal approval. You don't need everyone to agree with your choices. You don't need everyone to understand your journey. You don't need everyone to support your growth. You simply need the courage to remain aligned with your values. That doesn't mean becoming stubborn. It doesn't mean rejecting feedback. It doesn't mean ignoring wisdom. Authenticity isn't about refusing to learn. It's about refusing to betray yourself. There's a difference. A wise person remains open-minded, but they don't surrender their identity every time someone disagrees with them. A wise person listens, but they don't allow every outside voice to become an inside voice. Because eventually you realize something important. The people who genuinely belong in your life will not require you to become less authentic to keep them comfortable. Real relationships can survive honesty. Real friendships can survive boundaries. Real respect can survive disagreement. The relationships that collapse under authenticity were often being sustained by tall performance. And performance was never a stable foundation to begin with. So if you've noticed resistance appearing as you've become more confident, more self-aware, more disciplined, or more aligned with your values, don't automatically assume you're moving in the wrong direction. Sometimes resistance is not a warning sign. Sometimes it's confirmation. Confirmation that you're no longer living according to expectations that were never yours. Confirmation that you're finally becoming who you were meant to be. And that journey will always require courage. Because authenticity asks a difficult question every single day. Will you choose acceptance at the cost of yourself? Or will you choose yourself even when acceptance is not guaranteed? The answer to that question determines the quality of your entire life. And the people who ultimately find peace are not the ones who please everyone. They're the ones who stop abandoning themselves in order to do it. So remember this. The more authentic you become, the more resistance you may encounter. But the goal of life is not to become acceptable to everyone. The goal is to become unmistakably yourself. And that is a price worth paying for true freedom. By this point, a pattern should be becoming clear. People can resent your strengths. They can disguise envy as criticism. They can become uncomfortable with your authenticity. And if you're not careful, all of those reactions can lead you into one of the most exhausting traps a human being can enter. The trap of trying to control how other people perceive you. This is where so many people lose themselves, not because they lack intelligence, not because they lack talent, but because they become emotionally dependent on being understood, approved of, and accepted by everyone around them. At first it seems reasonable. After all, nobody wants to be misunderstood. Nobody enjoys being judged unfairly. Nobody likes hearing false assumptions about their character. So naturally, we try to explain ourselves. We try to clarify our intentions. We try to prove our sincerity. We try to show people who we really are. The problem is that this effort often becomes endless, because perception is not something you control. It never has been, and it never will be. You can control your actions. You can control your words. You can control your character. But the meaning people assign to those things exists entirely within their minds. And that distinction changes everything. Think about two people looking at the same mountain. One sees beauty, the other sees danger. The mountain hasn't changed. Only the perspective has. Human beings work the same way. People do not simply see reality. They interpret reality. Every person views the world through a lens shaped by their experiences, beliefs, fears, insecurities, values, and expectations. Which means people are not always reacting to who you are. Many times, they're reacting to the story they've created about who you are. And stories can be remarkably resistant to facts. This is why you can be generous and still be called selfish. You can be confident and still be called arrogant. You can be quiet and still be called rude. You can be ambitious and still be called greedy. You can be kind and still be misunderstood. The behavior stays the same. The interpretation changes. And when you truly understand this, you stop treating every opinion as objective truth. The ancient Stoic philosopher Epictetus observed that people are disturbed not by events, themselves, but by their interpretations of those events. That insight remains just as powerful today, because it reminds us that perception is often more about the observer than the observed. A person filled with distrust tends to see bad intentions everywhere. A person filled with insecurity tends to see threats everywhere. A person filled with resentment tends to see arrogance everywhere. And if you spend your life trying to correct every misunderstanding, you'll never have time to build the life you're meant to live. Yet many people attempt exactly that. They become trapped in what psychologists sometimes call approval-seeking behavior. Every decision becomes filtered through one question. What will people think? Before they speak, they worry. Before they act, they hesitate. Before they pursue a goal, they seek permission. Before they set a boundary, they anticipate criticism. Their life becomes less about purpose and more about perception, less about truth and more about appearance. And this creates a painful contradiction. The more desperately you seek approval, the less freedom you experience. Because approval is unstable. It changes constantly. What earns admiration today may invite criticism tomorrow. The crowd is unpredictable. Public opinion is temporary. And building your identity on temporary foundations creates permanent anxiety. You see this everywhere. People alter their personalities depending on who they're around. They suppress their opinions. They hide their ambitions. They avoid risks. They stay silent when they should speak. Not because they lack conviction, but because they fear rejection. And rejection feels threatening because human beings naturally desire belonging. That desire isn't weakness. It's part of our nature. For thousands of years, survival depended on being accepted by the tribe. Being excluded carried enormous consequences. But modern life requires a different kind of courage. The courage to understand that belonging should never require self-betrayal. Yet that's exactly what many people do. They trade authenticity for acceptance. They trade integrity for approval. They trade peace of mind for popularity. And they still discover something frustrating. Even after all that sacrifice, not everyone likes them. Because universal approval doesn't exist. It never has. No matter how thoughtful you are, someone will criticize you. No matter how kind you are, someone will misunderstand you. No matter how careful you are, someone will question your motives. No matter how successful you become, someone will diminish your achievements. This isn't pessimism. It's reality. And strangely enough, accepting this reality is incredibly liberating. Because the moment you stop trying to control every opinion, you recover enormous amounts of energy. Energy that was previously wasted on explanation. Energy that was previously wasted on overthinking. Energy that was previously wasted on defending yourself against every judgment. You begin focusing on what actually matters. Your actions. Your values. Your discipline. Your growth. Your character. The things you can control. One of the strongest signs of emotional maturity is recognizing the difference between reputation and character. Reputation exists in other people's minds. Character exists within you. Reputation changes depending on who's telling the story. Character remains the same regardless of who's watching. Reputation is fragile. Character is durable. And many people spend their entire lives protecting the wrong one. They obsess over reputation while neglecting character. They worry about appearances while ignoring substance. They focus on being liked instead of being respected. But respect and approval are not the same thing. Approval asks, do people agree with me? Character asks, am I living according to my values? One depends on others. The other depends on you. And that's why character creates peace. Because it places your identity back in your own hands. The philosopher Marcus Aurelius wrote that we waste much of our lives wondering what others think when we could be directing our attention toward becoming better ourselves. It's a simple idea, but a transformative one. Imagine how much lighter your life would feel if you stopped trying to manage every perception. Imagine how much confidence would emerge if you accepted that misunderstanding is sometimes unavoidable. Imagine how much freedom would appear if you stopped needing everyone to validate your hate. Choices. because that's the hidden cost of approval seeking. It keeps your emotional well-being hostage to circumstances you cannot control. And anything you cannot control should never determine your sense of worth. That doesn't mean becoming indifferent. It doesn't mean becoming reckless. It doesn't mean ignoring feedback. Wise people still listen. Wise people still reflect. Wise people still learn. But they don't surrender their identity every time someone forms an opinion. They understand a powerful truth. People are allowed to misunderstand you. People are allowed to disagree with you. People are allowed to dislike you. And none of those things automatically mean you've done something wrong. The goal is not to create a version of yourself that nobody can criticize. That person does not exist. The goal is to build a version of yourself that remains grounded even when criticism arrives. A version of yourself that values integrity more than approval. A version of yourself that chooses truth over performance. A version of yourself that understands that character matters more than perception. Because the moment you stop chasing control over how others see you, you finally gain control over how you see yourself. And that is where real confidence begins. So remember this. You cannot control every opinion, every assumption, or every misunderstanding. But you can control the person staring back at you in the mirror. And in the end, that is the only perception powerful enough to shape your destiny. After everything we've discussed, after understanding that your strengths can trigger insecurity, that envy often disguises itself as criticism, that authenticity creates resistance, and that you cannot control how other people perceive you, there is one final lesson that brings all of these ideas together. Your freedom begins the moment you stop needing validation. This is the lesson beneath every lesson. This is the truth hiding underneath so much human frustration, anxiety, disappointment, and self-doubt. Because if we're honest, most people are not suffering because they lack ability. They are suffering because they have attached their worth to the opinions of others. And the moment your worth becomes dependent on someone else's approval, you hand them a power they were never meant to have. Think about how much of life is spent chasing validation. People chase validation through achievement. They chase validation through relationships. They chase validation through social status. They chase validation through appearance. They chase validation through popularity. They chase validation through being liked, accepted, praised, admired, and recognized. At first glance, this seems normal. After all, appreciation feels good. Recognition feels rewarding. Encouragement is valuable. There is nothing wrong with enjoying those things. The problem begins when they become necessary. The problem begins when validation stops being something you appreciate and starts becoming something you require. Because anything you require for your sense of worth eventually gains control over you. And many people spend years trapped inside this invisible prison. They don't make decisions based on conviction. They make decisions based on reactions. They don't ask, "What do I believe?" They ask, "What will people think?" They don't ask, "What is right for my life?" They ask, "Will this be accepted?" Gradually, without realizing it, they become strangers to themselves. Not because they intended to, but because they became experts at listening to everyone except the one voice that mattered. Their own. One of the most profound realizations a person can experience is understanding that external validation is fundamentally unstable. The same people who praise you today may criticize you tomorrow. The same crowd that celebrates your success may question your decisions. The same voices that support you in one season may disappear in the next. Public opinion changes. Trends change. Relationships change. Circumstances change. But if your identity is built upon those things, then your confidence changes with them. And confidence that depends on conditions is not confidence. It is dependency. Real confidence emerges from something deeper. It emerges from self-respect. And self-respect is different from self-esteem. Self-esteem often rises and falls with outcomes. Self-respect remains rooted in principles. Self-esteem says, "I feel good because I succeeded." Self-respect says, "I value myself because I remain true to my values." One depends on results. The other depends on character. And character is infinitely more reliable. This is why some people remain strong, even when criticized. Not because criticism doesn't affect them, but because criticism is no longer the foundation of their identity. They know who they are. And when you know who you are, other people's opinions become information rather than instruction. You can listen without obeying. You can consider without surrendering. You can reflect without doubting your entire worth. That is emotional freedom. The philosopher Viktor Frankl once wrote that between stimulus and response, there is a space, and in that space lies our power to choose. Validation seeking shrinks that space. Every compliment creates excitement. Every criticism creates despair. Every opinion determines your emotional state. Your life becomes reactive. Freedom expands that space. Freedom allows you to hear praise without becoming dependent on it. Freedom allows you to hear criticism without being destroyed by it. Freedom allows you to remain grounded, regardless of what others decide to think. And that is a level of strength few people ever develop. Because developing it requires courage. It requires letting go of the fantasy that everyone will eventually understand you. It requires accepting that some people will misjudge you. Some people will dislike you. Some people will project their insecurities onto you. Some people will create stories about you that have little connection to reality. And your task is not to correct every story. Your task is to continue living your truth. This is where many people get stuck. They keep trying to earn approval from individuals who have already decided not to give it. They keep trying to prove themselves to people who aren't interested in understanding them. They keep exhausting themselves chasing acceptance from those who benefit from their insecurity. But approval earned through self-abandonment is never worth having. Because every time you betray yourself to gain acceptance, you lose something far more valuable than approval. You lose authenticity. You lose integrity. You lose peace. And eventually no amount of external praise can compensate for that loss. The people who experience genuine fulfillment understand something different. They understand that self-worth is an inside job. It cannot be outsourced. It cannot be delegated. It cannot be handed over to strangers, critics, followers, friends, family members, or public opinion. It must be built internally, quietly, deliberately, consistently. Every time you keep a promise to yourself, every time you maintain a boundary, every time you choose discipline over excuses, every time you act according to your values despite discomfort, you strengthen that foundation, and slowly, something remarkable begins to happen. The opinions that once controlled you lose their power. The criticism that once devastated you loses its sting. The rejection that once felt unbearable becomes manageable. Not because you've become cold, not because you've stopped caring, but because you've stopped confusing approval with worth. There is a difference, a very important difference. Approval is something others give. Worth is something you recognize. Approval can be withheld. Worth cannot be taken from you unless you surrender it. And once you understand that, life becomes lighter. You stop performing. You stop pretending. You stop chasing. You stop explaining yourself to people committed to misunderstanding you. Instead, you invest that energy into growth, into purpose, into contribution, into becoming the person you were capable of becoming all along. Because ultimately, the goal of life is not universal acceptance. It is not endless praise. It is not winning every person's approval. The goal is alignment. Alignment between your values and your actions. Alignment between your beliefs and your behavior. Alignment between who you are privately and who you are publicly. That alignment creates a peace that validation never can. Because validation is temporary, but self-respect endures. And when self-respect becomes stronger than your need for approval, something extraordinary happens. You become free. Free to speak honestly. Free to grow boldly. Free to pursue your purpose. Free to disappoint people when necessary. Free to walk away from what no longer serves you. Free to become exactly who you were meant to be. So if there is one thing I hope you remember from this conversation, let it be this. The people who secretly hate you may never change. The critics may never understand you. The doubters may never support you. But none of them hold the key to your worth. That key has been in your hands the entire time. The moment you stop asking the world for permission to value yourself is the moment your real life begins. And that is a freedom no one can ever take away.